Welcome back to Campus Pressbox, episode number 55. I'm Mitch Gatsky, stepping in for Damian Bowman this week, and I'm joined by Kristen, and you'll have to pardon me. I'm not totally sure how to pronounce your last name because we've never actually talked, other than through online message boards and whatnot.
Give it your best shot. I'm kind of curious.
I would say Boudica.
Nope, it is actually Botica.
Okay, see, that's like what I thought would be the wrong answer, I was going to say that, but then if I said that and it was wrong, that would have been a worse answer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true, because Botica is like the standard answer usually that I get.
Right. Well, now that we've got introductions out of the way, why don't we start, since we've never podcasted before, why don't we just start with, going through our Saturday routine as we come hurtling toward college football season. Next weekend, we got a lot of games on the schedule. What are you going to be doing, Kristen?
Oh, I don't even know at this point, honestly. There's too many games on the schedule. But I'm generally, especially living in Gainesville, I get to go to the Florida games. And if I don't go to the games, I still get up and tailgate and have a blast because everybody has their big screen TVs, and then I can watch whatever game I want and still go get drunk on campus with all the rest of the football fans. So that's probably what I'll be doing.
Have you ever planned to go to the game, started pre-gaming, and couldn't make it to the game?
Maybe once,
Maybe once.
a few years ago.
Freshman year?
Yeah, I think that was probably freshman year, sophomore year.
That's what those 2 years are for, so that you can not make those mistakes as upperclassmen.
I mean, it's pretty difficult here in Florida because it's still like 90 degrees out by the time you're going to the football game.
Oh, that's right. See, up here in Michigan, we got like a couple weeks of good weather, and then it'll be 50s again, which I like personally, but I'm sure you don't. You're from Tennessee, correct?
Yes. I actually did go to a football game and it was sleeting. That was a
Wow.
football game in South Bend. I went to a Notre Dame game like years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that.
It was a good game actually, and they beat Boston College back when that was the big rivalry.
Oh boy. I'm sure you ask Notre Dame fans, that still is a big rivalry.
I
So
don't
you're
know.
you are from Tennessee and decided to go to Florida. How did that happen?
That happened because I'm actually a lot smarter than I looked. So I got an academic scholarship here and I wanted to go to a big SEC school with good athletics, and Florida kind of screams that at you. So it just kind of worked out that way for me.
Nice. And your dad, correct me if I'm wrong, your dad is a big Vols fan?
Huge Vols fan, season ticket holder.
So how does he feel about you being a Gator?
He's still getting used to it 6 years later, so I mean, he's doing what he can. He always is going to root for the Vols and has a lot more faith in them than I ever do still at this point. But when it comes to the Gators, as long as it doesn't negatively affect the Vols, he'll root for them, just very quietly.
So when it comes down to it and it's Vols versus Gators, are you going with the team that you grew up watching as a kid or the school that you go to now?
Oh gosh, this is always hard. But last year, I went to the game with my family. They were all in UT orange or white, and I was wearing blue. So that tells you what side of it I
Nice.
usually stand on.
Nice. Well,
Yeah, it's
and the
hard.
good part about that is, if one team's not doing so hot, then you can just flip-flop.
Yeah, and actually, that game is always my favorite game because it's the one weekend out of the entire year that one of my teams is guaranteed to win.
There you go. All right. Now that we've figured out who you are, well, I've figured out who you are a little bit. Um, I got to ask you about some specific UT happenings this season. We saw last year the expectations got ratcheted up quite a bit. People were excited for what Butch Jones and Josh Dobbs and, Jalen Hurd, all those guys, what they were going to be able to do last year. It didn't quite pan out for them. I'd say they did take a step forward just because they showed me some things that made me believe they're a better team than we've been giving them, than they've really deserved credit for the last few years. So this year, it's gone to an even higher level. And I have to ask you, do you think this is the year where something has to give at Tennessee?
So is this the year that Tennessee is going to actually be the old Tennessee program that I knew when I was growing up? I hope it is. I'm still not 100% sure. I really do think they have a lot of great things going for them. And this is probably my dad talking right now, honestly. But they do
That's
have...
okay. Welcome to the show.
Exactly. I have a little bit of my dad in me, but that's all. That's good because it means that I like football that much more. But Tennessee does have so many returning players that are key players and that are going to be key contributors on both sides of the ball, that gives them a huge advantage over a lot of other teams that don't really have established quarterbacks, for example. Seth would argue with me about this, but Josh Dobbs he turns out to be an advantage for the Vols, regardless of whether or not he can pass the ball more than 10 yards on a play. And their defense, too. I mean, Tennessee has had a pretty solid defense, but never will it be as good as Florida's or Alabama's. But still, their defense is definitely going to be a big asset to them this year, and I think if they can combine it and actually keep it up for an entire 4 quarters, not just 3.5 quarters, then maybe this will be their year. I'm hopeful for them, honestly. I would never root against them.
Is this the year? Is the seat getting hot for Butch Jones? Is it this year or he's out?
Oh, gosh. I mean, there were people that wanted him out last year after the first few games. After he lost to Florida, they wanted him out. I wasn't too quick to jump on that train. But this year, I think if he can't win the SEC East, I think he's going to be on the hot seat, honestly. And I think it's warranted at this point. He really does have all the pieces to the puzzle. And if he can't put the puzzle together, then what are they paying him the big bucks for?
And a lot of the puzzle pieces that I think might fall into play for Tennessee this year, just the fact that there's a whole lot going on in the SEC East right now, and you're not really sure what to expect from teams like Georgia, Florida even. South Carolina has its issues.
They have Will Muschamp.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of new coaches, a lot of question marks, and really we're looking at Tennessee as being the team that we know most about and it really does look like the team to beat in the East.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't bet against Tennessee at this point because I just don't see a better option. Well, Georgia has Kirby Smart, which is obviously a fantastic hire for them, considering anybody that comes from Alabama, like Jim McElwain, tends to be a pretty good coach. It's still, there's a lot of things that are up in the air for their program. And it'll be interesting to see how Chubb comes back off his injury this season, too. Granted, their backup for Chubb did a fantastic job most of last season anyways.
True. That is another big part of it. So let's transition. You wrote a couple of pieces in the last couple of weeks about only being able to watch one game a week in the SEC. And first of all, that had to be very tough because, as we all know, any given week, the SEC schedule is just loaded top to bottom with games that, I mean, if there's nothing else on, why not watch Texas A&M versus, I don't know, Tennessee? I mean, there's just even the mid-level teams, even the lower level teams, Kentucky and Vanderbilt may be excluded. You really do want to watch all those games because they're just, the quality of play is just there. For me, it's just the closest thing to NFL football that there is in college football. Anyway, with all that being said, if you could pick one game in this huge first week of college football, what game would it be?
I'm going to have to stick with the one that I picked out in that article and actually go with the Ole Miss FSU matchup. I think that that is going to be a very interesting game. FSU ended last season on kind of a low note with their bowl appearance, but Ole Miss ended it on a high note, so they kind of ended it at different places. But going into this season, there's a lot more expected of FSU. Last year was supposedly a rebuilding year for them, and they still did fantastic, and I hate to admit that, but they did. And Ole Miss last year did pretty well too. They were just very inconsistent. So for me, it really is going to be interesting to see which Ole Miss team shows up. Because if the Ole Miss team that showed up to the Swamp last year shows up, then FSU is just going to run right over them. But if not, I think it's going to be a fantastic game, and I hope that Chad Kelly can put his money where his mouth is, because he's been talking a lot about being the best quarterback in college football.
He has, and it's very interesting because as much as Seth does hate on Josh Dobbs, I think the nod has to go to him, just in terms, maybe not in terms of being a pure, college or a pro-level quarterback, but in terms of being a leader and doing what his team needs him to do. I think I would take Dobbs in the position that he's in more than Kelly in the position that he's in this year. What do you think about that?
I agree with that. I actually trust Dobbs' supporting cast a lot more. He has a lot of good players around him. The offensive line is a little bit more experienced now at Tennessee. They have a couple of great running backs with Hurd and Kamara. So even if Dobbs can't figure something out himself, he has other people to fall back on, and those people lead by will follow after his example. With Chad Kelly, I'm not sure that he's shown as much leadership for his team, and I think that that could be a problem, because if Chad Kelly isn't firing, or if they face a fantastic secondary like what happened with Florida last season, then they're going to be in a lot of trouble, because he's not going to feel like he has the same kind of options to rely on. So I would definitely rather have Dobbs.
And we saw it last year with Kelly. There were some games where he needed to step up and he couldn't, and that was with a cast of players around him, including Laramie Tunsil, including Laquan Treadwell. And now there's a whole new group of guys around him, and he's going to be relied on a lot more. And like you said, if he doesn't show up, there's a good chance that Florida State's just going to run right over Ole Miss here in this opening game. And speaking of running them over, what do you think about Dalvin Cook, the running back from Florida State?
I am with Seth on this one, where he said that, Dalvin Cook actually could be a Heisman candidate, and he's the one that people are ignoring. Dalvin Cook was fantastic last season. He ran for, I think it was a record amount of yards for the school, actually. And he was even injured off and on, I think it's a hamstring injury, actually, that he was battling throughout the season. So if Dalvin Cook can stay healthy, he is very scary. I would not want to be up against him. I think that the Florida defense is going to have some problems with him when it comes to the last week in November.
And that game also is in the Citrus Bowl. Just another thing another interesting note on that one. Other big games across college football on that first week. A lot of neutral site games as they do kind of the kickoff series, I guess you could say.
A lot of them aren't even really neutral, though, honestly, if we're talking about it. Like the LSU-Wisconsin game is not neutral, because that's way closer to Wisconsin. That game, obviously, at the Citrus Bowl isn't really that neutral either, because it's way closer to where all the Florida State fans are.
Yep. And the other ones on the list, I mean, Oklahoma is going to Houston to play the Houston Cougars at the Houston Texans Stadium, not really a neutral site. Lambeau Field is hosting LSU and Wisconsin, as you mentioned. North Carolina travels to the Georgia Dome to play Georgia. Again, not too much of a neutral site. And USC versus Alabama in Jerry World in Dallas. I got to think there's going to be way more Alabama fans than USC fans, but that is a fan base that probably should travel well. And for me, that's the game right there that I'd have to pick, just because I need to see what Alabama's got this year. Every year it seems like they just reload. Nick Saban's got the guys waiting on the bench who are just itching to get in there as soon as the upperclassmen and the early draftees depart. And it's just next guy up. And really, it's the same team with new names. And I'm really looking forward to seeing them play a tough team this first week. I'm hoping USC can give them a bit of a fight there because I'm just sick of seeing teams roll over weak opponents in the early season, and then by the time they've just racked up 11, 12 wins, and by the time it's time to pick a playoff, they basically get it by default because they're undefeated. And I think the playoff system has really made it more important for these big teams like Oklahoma, like LSU, like even Clemson and Notre Dame are both playing road games in the first week. You're seeing teams go out and take risks in their scheduling, and I think it's going to start paying off big in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I could agree with that. Actually, speaking of the scheduling, I recently wrote about the ACC scheduling. I don't know if you saw that one.
I did. I see everything.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what everybody sees now. I try to see most things, but I wouldn't say everything.
Yeah, maybe not recently, not everything recently, but over the summer, it was everything.
Yeah, I mean, that scheduling issue for them, too, it really comes down to what they want their strength of schedule to be like, because honestly speaking here, the ACC isn't that fantastic, and most of the schools there aren't going to be very strong opponents to have on your schedule. But if a team has that 8-2 and they can go and schedule two other Power 5 opponents on their schedule, then they're probably going to have a better shot at getting favorable views from the college football playoff committee at that point, just because they're taking more risks. They're going out of their conference. They might end up playing on the road. You never really know with that, or even on a neutral site. But those games just show you something different than what you're going to get in conference play, especially in a conference that's not quite as strong overall in football.
I'm glad you said this because I think it had to be Damian and I always find myself going back and forth with him about college football related things and really just anything in general. We can't seem to agree on anything. But he was making the argument last year that the ACC is actually one of the stronger conferences of the Power 5 conferences because of the addition of Notre Dame, and you look at schools like Florida State and Clemson. And I said, that's all fine and good, but that makes for a very top-heavy conference. Whereas you look at the Big Ten, and I think there are, the Michigan States, the Michigans, the Ohio States, maybe even Iowa if you want to throw them up there. And then the second tier is what makes a good conference. That's the depth. That's the teams that fill in the 15 to the 25 spots and, fall in and out of the top 25, but there's still good programs that are going to go out on the road and put up a fight in a tough conference road game. I don't see that from the ACC. So I'm glad to hear you say that because to me, Notre Dame didn't really do themselves a favor by adding 5, 6, whatever it is, ACC games to their schedule. And I think that might be why we're seeing them go down to Texas to start this season, because not only is it a big moneymaker for them anywhere they go, there's going to be Notre Dame fans who travel, and that just increases the brand. But I think that's also a big game for them just because it's on the road. Texas might not be that great of a team, but you can't deny that going on the road and beating Texas week 1 is a good opening line on your resume there.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely a better way to start the season than, maybe playing an ACC opponent on the road aside from Clemson or Florida State at this point, really. But I definitely agree with what you said there, because I think it was last year when I went through and did an article comparing all of the Power 5 conferences and saying why I still thought that the SEC was still the best. Sorry, Big Ten. But I'm a little bit biased towards the SEC, but what I went through and looked at is just every single team in the conference, not just the top team, not just the top 2 or 3 teams. I went and looked through every single tier and looked at how every team matched up against other non-conference opponents when they played them, and had to go through that list that way to actually be able to get a good gauge on how strong the conference is as a whole, because it's really not fair to judge by just 1 or 2 teams. I wouldn't say that the ACC is the best conference because of Florida State and Clemson. I don't think that's an accurate representation of the conference as a whole, and I just don't think that's fair to the rest of the teams in the other conferences that could probably beat every ACC team except those 2 any given Saturday.
So there's the 4 teams make the playoff. There's 5 power conferences. One of them has to miss it. Who's going to be that conference to miss out on the playoff this year?
Pac-12.
Just like last year?
Answer. Yeah, that's a short answer, but I just don't see anybody stepping up from the Pac-12 and actually making it that far this season either.
Not a Stanford fan?
Not a huge Stanford fan, no. I would say that if it's not the Pac-12, it would be the Big 12. I don't really trust them either, honestly. A lot of their programs have just been so up and down, you don't really know what to expect from them. But if I had to bet on somebody, it would be the Pac-12 missing out again.
Do you think that's just because Stanford doesn't play sexy football?
I mean, that could have something to do with it because they're going to want to see good football. And good football has a lot of different definitions depending on how you're viewing it. It's the wins, it's the point differential, it's all of that. But I'm not sure that Stanford necessarily always has a schedule that matches up to some of these other teams, especially now that some of these other teams are amping up their schedules and facing other Power 5 opponents that they wouldn't usually face.
It's tough for a team like Stanford because they are on the West Coast. The games that they do play at home, chances are the East Coasters aren't watching those games. They're not up late enough to see them. And when Stanford does go on the road, like we saw last year, they have to play places like Northwestern, and they end up losing, and that's what killed their season last year when it came down to it. I don't think the committee, they looked at that game and said, maybe Stanford doesn't really deserve it. Just because they couldn't finish the deal. They couldn't round out that season that would have made them worthy of being in the top 4. And my point by asking if it's just because they don't play sexy football is I think, if Oregon is in the same spot that Stanford is right now, I think Oregon would be hyped up like you wouldn't believe. Like, oh, these guys are going to make a run and this, that, and the other thing, but it's Stanford, and all of a sudden, yes, they're the class of the conference, but it's kind of by default. A lot of the quarterbacks have moved on, and we're not too sure what to expect from some of the teams who've made steps up, like Washington State. What do you think about comparing Stanford and Oregon?
I think you made a pretty valid point there. Honestly, even just based off of hearing the names as far as football goes, I already associate a lot better football overall with Oregon. And that's just partially because of years past, obviously. But I think that back when they were dominating everybody, they had a really powerful offense, and that high-flying offense that everybody loves to watch. And that's something that's going to get everybody hyped up. And if we're being honest here, the college football playoffs are a big moneymaker, or at least that's what they want them to be. So do you want a team in there that has an exciting offense like that? Of course you do. Do you want a team that maybe isn't quite as exciting and doesn't necessarily excite football fans as a whole? Maybe that plays into the decision making there. Honestly, I would choose watching Oklahoma over Stanford any day.
So you mentioned the high-flying offense of Oregon, and everybody likes to watch it. What is it about SEC football that makes it the best in your mind?
The defense, actually. Offense is always fun, but I love the down and dirty, tough defense of the SEC.
That's what I like to hear.
Football. Yeah, I watch it for the defense. That's what gets me excited. I know a lot more about the defensive players in the conference than I do about the offensive players. But I mean, that's what
All
makes
right,
the
so
game
let's
really
hear it.
exciting.
Let's
We'll
hear it. Who
have,
are the defensive players to watch in the SEC this year?
oh, I don't know where to go
Give
with
us
this one.
give us three names. Just give us three names.
Well, this name everybody already knows, but Jalen Tease Tabor from Florida, cornerback. He's replacing
Yep.
Vernon Hargraves, but last season when he was playing opposite Hargraves, he arguably did a better job than Hargraves. Granted, that might just partially be because people didn't target Hargraves because they know better than that at this point. But I think that Tabor is really going to be very exciting to watch, and he's always really amusing off the field, too. I don't know if you've seen some of his antics, but I always enjoy that side of him as well. For Tennessee, actually, I'm a big fan of Sutton. I think that he is actually going to be a really good leader for their secondary, on top of just being a good player to have in there. And man, I'm trying to think of who else I want to pick for defense. Whew. This one's kind of a hard one for me. I might actually have to go with Ole Miss. They have had some really, really, really exciting defensive ends lately.
Yes.
I think it was, Marquise Haynes, I think is how you say his name. He had a ton of sacks in the past 2 years, and that's one of my favorite things to see on defense is the sacks, too. Because I don't know, I love watching those for whatever reason. It's just the speed and the explosiveness that takes. I think it's really exciting, so I think he's definitely going to be another one to watch that's not on one of my favorite teams necessarily.
All right. Before we wrap it up, I have to ask you one more question. We spoke at the beginning of the show about some of the pre-gaming that goes on, so I have to ask you, what's your favorite drink as you're getting ready for college football Saturday?
I'm a beer girl, honestly. I throw on my cowboy boots and a sundress and go drink some beer. But sometimes a little whiskey going in with that beer isn't too bad. Just, speeds up the process a little bit.
You got some great answers tonight, I have to say.
I'm a lot cooler than people think I am.
That might be the title of the show right there. I'm a lot cooler than people think I am.
I'm pretty sure Damien would love that. He'll probably laugh at that.
That's going to do it for us here on Campus Press Box number 55. Kristen, tell the people where they can find you.
My Twitter is at OGKristen, KRISTENB. And you can also email me, kristen.botica@campuspressbox.com.
Find me on Twitter at GreatGatsky. And yeah, shoot me an email, mitch.gatsky@campuspressbox.com. For Kristen Botica, not Botica, as some might think, I'm Mitch Gatsky signing off.